Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Peter and the entire CARE organization crew for inviting me to do the presentation. I really enjoyed it already so far. I hope it stays like that. The general title of my presentation is rather broad, but the main topic and the main content that I will be discussing is actually driven by research that I'm currently conducting with two of my colleagues in Tilburg. One of them is in the audience. It's Philip Joos. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, this also is driven by a broader European initiative on doing IFRS research in a cross-border setting. It's called Intact. So just a brief look at the agenda. I'm going to skip most of the first session about the introduction of harmonization. Most of you are familiar with what happened, what was going on, so no introduction then, given the sake of time too. What I'm going to focus on is harmonization effects that we expect or might not expect in Europe, given what has changed over the last period in time. Europeans are well aware of the fact that actually Europe went through a turmoil situation, not during the past couple of years, but that this has already been going on for more than 15 years and goes back to the early 90s, when the internal market was actually set up. So the focus is on Europe, EU 15 countries. We're going to look in a time series situation how the reporting environment actually evolved. Specifically, I'm focusing on the accrual reporting process in EU 15 in that time period. And specific focus also on pre versus post IFRS adoption. Following on that talk, I will introduce a bit of the specific peculiarities of the European setting, where institutional enforcement might be varying across different settings. And secondly, the role of information environment might also be very different across countries, and what the effect might be of those peculiar types on the accruals reporting process. And then we'll wrap up the study. So accrual harmonization efforts, the only thing I want to say about this slide is that Europe kind of followed a separate way for harmonization a long time ago, but as time went on, it became clear that Europe was on the side of the IFRS. And in 2000, the intention to actually mandate IFRS reporting for all listed firms became clear, as from 2005 onwards. And the literature now also shows that there's currently a debate about should we also allow IFRS reporting only for US firms. And then at the bottom of my slide you'll see the lingua franca. Should we actually have this lingua franca, the common language for financial reporting purposes, in which we can easily communicate in a general sense without any frictions or problems between a Texan, cowboy, oil, lantern.
Correct. This is politically correct, right?
Yeah, why not? So I can do it. I should have noticed that it's not my cartoon, it's from the Financial Times. So I kind of liked it. So when we talk about reporting characteristics, we can actually discuss a lot of the quality characteristics of accounting and reporting. What came into the presentation of yesterday too was that indeed the accruals reporting process might already be indicative of good quality or bad quality. And we can discuss for a long time if what we measure is really quality or what general research is measuring is quality. But nevertheless, in this study I want to focus on how the accruals cash flow relation is actually going on over time, and if IFRS at all made any difference. So the views that exist in the literature are you're also very familiar with. You have the decision relevance component that is been inside the accrual reporting process versus the opportunism. So the earnings management story versus giving more information by reporting through accruals. And that has developed into a large body of research. I name a few of them. I want to focus on the last studies because they also focus extensively on the accruals and cash flow correlation as an important quality characteristic. The Land and Lang study and Lloyd's et al. So to show you the framework how it works, Europe, you must be aware of the fact that, and I'll show you this at the next slide, the integration has moved on since the early 90s. So the economic forces are clearly working. We are well aware of that, and we try to control for that. But apart from that, we know that political forces across countries are different, and that private forces are also an important driver for the demand of quality reporting. So all that, this entire story makes us to have a setting where we expect financial reporting quality to depend upon these characteristics and forces. So this is what I was talking about. To illustrate you how the process was actually going on. If you look at the early 90s when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, over a time period evolving to the IFRS introduction, and you look at dispersion that takes place within Europe of some macroeconomic indicators, there's no doubt that you can see the time trend which is taking place in those data. So in an economic sense, there's clearly a convergence going on. The question is, what's going on in reporting practices? We have a lot of analysis in the paper. I'll only focus on two subsets of analysis. But first of all, we study in a multivariate way how the accruals cash flow process varies across periods, time periods, and countries. And the time periods that we introduce are economic recessions versus expansions. And we think that it's quite sensible to do so because, as we also heard yesterday in the talk of Kenneth Lee, saying that IFRS impact was most probably only to be felt in downward periods. Well, this is actually the same reasoning that we had in our setup. So we split up recession and expansion periods to study how the accruals reporting process is going on. On top of that, an important part of the study currently focuses on the role of information environment. What's the role of analysts and institutionals as monitors of this financial reporting process? Just briefly to show you what the sample is, we use Thomson data, and you can see that over time the listings in Europe have increased too. Currently we're at the level of above 4,000. This is non-financial EU listed firms that are covered in WorldScope. Our sample that we have to do the analysis on take about 50,000 observations. The bulk of that is situated in the top 3 countries, UK, Germany and France, and the rest being somewhat spread across other countries. Because we know that the economic forces are playing, and you saw that the new listings were actually increasing quite a lot, we also create a constant sample. So we require that the firm remains active or survives for at least 15 years during the period. That significantly reduces the number to, and I have a pointer, to a lot lower level. So about only 1/4 of the firms survive. So what do we find? This is a box whisker plot which should actually show you the story of what's going on in the accruals cash flow variation or correlation. If you look at the medians, or excuse me, the mean levels, you see over time that the conclusion would be, if you look at the early 90s, the first recession period that we actually identified, and this recession definition is based on Eurocoin, which would be the NBER equivalent in Europe. Expansion periods, late 90s, again the recession, 2001 to 3, and then 2005 to 7, and we might discuss whether we could overlap the expansion period, but it's also coinciding with IFRS, so that's the reason why we do not split up that period. If you look at the 4 time periods and how the accruals cash flow correlation is going on, you can see the upward trend. So on average, there's less negative correlation between accruals and cash flow, which might be indicative of less smoothing. What's also important is that if you look at the IFRS period and you look at the interquartile range or the entire distribution, you can see that there's a huge variation, and that the variation did not actually alter a lot compared to what happened in the other the previous expansion period of the early 90s. So one conclusion might already be that IFRS itself did not really shape the accruals reporting process substantially differently compared to previous periods. If you look at the controls or the constant sample, the smoothing is more, or the smoothing characteristic is more stable, but nevertheless, the most important conclusion is that even for the constant sample, we see a lot of cross-country variation in accruals cash flow correlation. So could the information environment actually change a lot to this correlation, the smoothing behavior that we might pick up or that we intend to pick up with our analysis? Well, if that might be the case, then we're mainly interested in analyst following or in institutional investor holdings. And not on purpose, but I know that both of the authors of the papers which I referenced are in the audience. I think it's interesting to make a reference to them because they also try to link the importance of the information environment and the corporate governance role of analysts and institutional investors on the reporting process of the company. For Europe, we use IBIS files to cover analyst coverage and Amadeus ownership files for covering institutional ownership in Europe. So this is a graph showing you what the average and the Q3 analyst coverage is for the European set of countries that we have. You can have a look at them. It's generally consistent with what Steve yesterday presented, the European firms I saw in his research, compared to the coverage that I find in our sample. With respect to institutional investor base, I want to point out large differences across countries too. Like if you look at Germany, for instance, and if you look at the number of institutional holdings, just the count of them, you can see that the median is very low. It's only 1, mean 3.5. If you look at the proportion that they own in the company, it's around 7.5% of total shareholder value and 1.4% in the median. So very low institutional holders or institutional investor base, while for the UK you see a totally different picture. On average 9, Q3 is at 13, and the proportion that they own is also significantly larger. So what we do then is we estimate a model which is mainly or partly based on a recent JFV paper by you, which came out in the recent issue, and in which we try to explain whether the excess analyst coverage, which we measure in a first step, explaining by typical elements that might explain analyst coverage in an economy, and add some country and year effect. Then also employ in a second step, where we actually use the error term of the first step as a proxy for excess analyst coverage. This might be a positive or negative number, and that might be a good indicator whether or not excess analyst coverage is driving or helping in monitoring the accruals cash flow reporting process. And we also partition for high versus low enforcement countries based on the Hope classification, but if we do some additional tests on a rule of law, everything is quite similar. We do similar analysis with the analyst also for institutional holdings to see whether our reasoning counts or is likely to be there, not only in the analyst setting but also institutional base. What do we find? We run the analysis. In the first regression we do no separation on enforcement mechanisms that are going on. If you look at the coefficient at cash flow minus 0.42, minus 42 negative, suggesting that over all years in our sample, from early 90s until 2007, we do find a negative accruals cash flow correlation, as you might expect. More important is that our variable on the excess coverage, which is interacting with the cash flow variable, is positive. So the interpretation would be if you have more, or if you have one excess analyst on covering your company, it would actually mitigate the negative correlation between accruals and cash flow by almost 2%. If you then look at the regression with all the interactions going on and split up per time period, and I think that maybe, how much time do you have, Peter?
5 minutes.
Oh, 5, okay, so I can actually discuss everything. So second regression shows us that if you split up, and might be more interesting for the next presentation to just show you the marginal effect, but as you can see already over here is that the cash flow correlation for the low enforcement countries is at almost minus 0.6. If you look at the correlation coefficient for the high enforcement countries, it's less negative. Okay, the combined effect would be somewhere around the number that we find for the full sample. If you then look at what the effect is of excess coverage in low enforcement countries and high enforcement countries, you can see that there is an effect in the low enforcement countries, but that there's a statistically significant extra effect in high enforcement countries. If you look at the separate time periods, maybe two things will like the pointer is not working anymore. Two things might attract your attention. First of all, that we see that in low enforcement countries, excess coverage is actually mitigating the negative accruals cash flow correlation, but only so in P1, P3, which were the recession periods. If you then look at P4, which is the IFRS period, might be of most interest to us, we show, or we can actually observe, that the excess analyst coverage is mitigating that correlation structure only so, but to a large extent in high enforcement countries. So the conclusion that we currently have is that actually this excess analyst coverage as a proxy for good corporate governance taking place within the information environment of the company is actually helping increasing the quality of reporting standards, and that, or reporting quality, excuse me, and that the standard itself, like the IFRS, are not necessarily leading to this result. So actually findings on a large scale which are consistent with what has been shown in the literature already, namely that simple introduction of accounting standards per se are not sufficient to induce quality. So conclusion, if you look at reporting in the European Union across the 90s, you would see behavior, you would conclude that there is indicative behavior of smoothing, that this tendency seems to fade out over time, but we have to be aware of the economic forces that are playing, so the constant sample shows that the smoothing behavior is still there. We find substantial variation across countries, and the box-whisker plots, they actually have the correlation coefficients in them. But if you look at specific countries like Sweden versus Greece, it's a totally different picture. I don't want to offend specific countries, but that's how it goes on. Like Sweden is from a very negative coefficient and moves to a lot less negative coefficient, while Greece is like flat all the time. There seems to be no effect of whatever changing environment or standards. Mandatory IFRS had no sudden switch in the reporting behavior that we observe, and we do find that institution and firm-specific incentives actually are important for mitigating this relationship. So if you look at the information effect itself, analyst following, institutional holdings, and the effect in period 4, IFRS period, is mainly there in high enforcement countries. And if I'm correct, I want to say thank you for your attention. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, we've got some time.
I guess my question is just one of the bottle half full or half empty. I mean, you stress that it works better in high enforcement countries, but when on one of your slides, the triple interaction was like 1/100th of the main effect. So, like it's making
but you have to,
but only in the strict statistical sense, and you've got 4,000 observations. So, you're going to get something.
Let's go back to the slide which you're referring at. It's like the like the
0.006 compared to 0.59. I like it's there, but it's
but actually
big, is it?
You have to take into account that you actually have to multiply this by the excess coverage. So this number goes from -30 to +40. So that's how it works. If I would rank it and make it like continuous between 0 and 1, you would have a different coefficient. Now you have to actually interact this with, like saying there is an excess coverage of 5 analysts within that setting, within that high enforcement setting, and that can actually be multiplying the coefficient too. But I agree that at first sight it might sound very weak effect.
In estimating the benchmark for excess analyst coverage, did you control for country level effects?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
Sorry.
I went a bit fast, I know, but yeah, we did include country level effect because, as you already saw on the picture before, there's an effect. With it. Also, there's a large difference between countries of analyst coverage. So you need to control for what's going on in the country in itself. This is the analyst coverage. Right. If you look at the mean, so for Spain it's higher than it is, for instance, for Belgium or Germany. So you need to control for the country level effects.
I would argue that there's a cultural effect that in some cultures the relationship would extract more information. Or
works differently.
Exactly. Thanks.
Hey, Christof.
Hi.
If I understand those regressions correctly, I think what you're capturing here is the average correlation, like say the average accrual cash flow correlation. And my thought when I was looking at those box plot is that it's interesting perhaps not to look at the average, but the dispersion. Because if you're talking about convergence, the mean might be lower or higher, doesn't matter, but the distribution might be a lot more centered. Have you looked at that?
Oh yes. So I hope that would actually show up from the box plots too, that you can see that the interquartile range is actually is not decreasing. It's actually moving away, and you see that some countries they stay at the same level, like I mentioned, two of them, and other countries they go to another reporting level, another reporting.
Right, but let's say, for example, in those regressions on analysts and all those things, do you have is the dispersion the dependent variable, or is that mean? Because I think you could have, like, say, the dispersion, and then look whether the dispersion shrink more if you have more institutions or not.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. Currently, we do it actually at the firm level. So at the firm level, and then controlling for countries effects. But if we could also organize this at a different level, I guess.
In groups, and then having like kind of distribution of the dispersion in a given year, and see if that shrink.
That's a very good suggestion. Thanks.
Questions?
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm taking over.
This is just a question on how much the accruals would have changed once you go to IFRS by country. It seems like some countries, their local gap would have been closer to IFRS to begin with, so you wouldn't expect much of a change there. But in other countries, you would expect a lot of a change, but it seems like that you aren't showing that. So are they saying they're on IFRS, but essentially they're staying on local gap?
That would be a rather heavy conclusion, or is that a very sound conclusion? It's not like that, I guess. What we did found is that apart from this more like overall study that we did, we also went into detail into annual reports to check what was going on in the reporting and what some firms do report and others don't report, and with respect to disclosure or just reporting habits. And we do find a lot of country differences with respect to how firms want to say something about the reporting strategies. And what you don't see, of course, is how this is essentially affecting the accruals process as we measure it with a broad measure. But we might have an indication that this is exactly the reason why you don't see that some countries who were actually far away from IFRS are converging quite swiftly to it. It might take on for a long time, might take them more time than what we are observing right now in this short time period. So it's not like a swift movement. That's what our expectation is.
Okay. Final question. Right.
This is sort of a follow-up to Fred's question, which is, it seems like there should be some kind of an industry effect or something, and to the extent that you're combining by countries and things, you can be getting different bundles of firms in effect, to either do some kind of a match or to do sort of an industry kind of an approach would, because everything in me is when I see this saying, okay, is it still a national gap? Is it, because if things aren't coming together, then industry or the fact that you're not getting a homogeneous kind of sort seems to be something that has to be going on. Otherwise, you should see, presumably, some kind of movement towards.
Okay, so the industry we took into account, it's not in the presentation, but we stress that quite a lot in our paper, that indeed like type of industry that you're in might totally affect or actually explain how the accrual cash flow correlation is working. So we take it into account. And what I did in this presentation is actually focus on the constant sample, because there we know that industries remain equal or equally represented across our sample, and that then the industry effect might affect our results less. But you're right, and we definitely take into account the industry effect. It's there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Christof.
Thanks.